My wife left our gallery opening with her hand on another man's back. When she told me to know my place in front of 50 strangers, I set down my champagne, walked out, and never looked back. A year later she showed up at my door begging for help. There's a specific kind of quiet that takes over a room the second your wife tears you apart in front of 50 people you've never met. And I can tell you exactly what it sounds like, because I've lived it. It sounds like that frozen moment right after a grenade pin gets yanked. That one heartbeat where everything stops. Where the whole world seems to suck in a breath and just wait for the blast that's already on its way, the one that nobody can do a thing to stop. I was standing right in the middle of the Hartwell Gallery in downtown Atlanta, surrounded by people who probably dropped more on a single pair of shoes than I cleared in an entire month. I was holding a glass of champagne that cost more than my first car. And I was watching my wife, Miranda, laughing at something another man had just breathed into her ear, his hand sitting on the small of her back like he'd already signed the deed on every part of her. The gallery reeked of expensive perfume, pretension, and the specific brand of desperation that only truly insecure people produce when they're working overtime to convince everyone around them that they've earned their spot in the room. My name is Daniel Wright. 38 years old. By that point in my life, I had already made it through 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan, a helicopter crash that had no business leaving me breathing, 17 separate shrapnel wounds that had mapped themselves across my torso like a battle record, and the particular kind of loneliness that burrows into your bones when you finally accept that the woman you married sees you as nothing more than a convenient stand-in she's been holding on to until something worth keeping comes along. I'd earned a Bronze Star for dragging 3 wounded Marines out of a vehicle that was actively on fire while enemy rounds were still coming in. I'd been promoted twice for leading under conditions that would have snapped most men. Every soldier I'd ever served alongside had respected me, not because I demanded it, but because I showed up, did the work, and never asked anyone to take on something I wasn't willing to handle myself. That evening I had on my best suit, a navy blue one Miranda had approved with a half-hearted nod about 3 years before. I'd made sure every crease was sharp and every button was clean. Still, standing in that gallery, I felt like a fraud. The art on the walls was abstract nonsense, the kind of thing that looks like a toddler got loose with a full paint set, and yet everyone around me was nodding at it with this deep, serious expression, like they were receiving some kind of divine transmission from a gray canvas with a single red dot in the corner. I kept wondering how many of them actually saw something in it, and how many were just too scared to be the first one to admit they had no clue what they were looking at. Miranda was holding court near that ugly piece, Emergence of the Corporate Soul, the plaque said, surrounded by her colleagues from the investment firm. Every one of them looked like they'd been assembled directly from a catalog for people with more money than sense. The man with his hand on her back was Vince Caldwell, 40 years old, wearing Italian wool, moving through rooms like a predator who'd already decided what he wanted. He'd been orbiting Miranda for months. Always at the right events. Always with the right thing to say. Always looking at her like she was a position he was positioning himself to acquire. I'd watched their routine play out for weeks, convincing myself Miranda was just being polite. Networking. Doing what she had to do to survive in a cutthroat industry. But something about the way she leaned into his touch that night landed in my gut with a certainty I'd been working hard not to face. The people circling them were familiar from other events Miranda had pulled me to. Harrison Blake, hedge fund guy, just lost his trophy wife to her personal trainer. Patricia Wentworth, corporate attorney with a reputation for ruthlessness that bled straight from her work life into her personal one. And Tyler Morrison, a venture capitalist who'd built his fortune by funding companies that made people's lives marginally worse in exchange for marginal convenience. These were Miranda's people now. The tribe she'd chosen. And watching them cluster together made it unmistakably clear just how far apart she and I had drifted across 7 years of marriage. I walked over because that's what a husband does. Because I'd sat in 45 minutes of traffic to get to an event Miranda had told me was critical for her career. Because somewhere, buried deep, I still believed that the woman I had actually married, 7 years ago, was still somewhere inside the polished, cold stranger who looked at me lately like I was an inconvenience she hadn't quite figured out how to eliminate. My hands were rough from years of heavy machinery work at the port. I noticed, as I moved through the crowd, how soft and manicured everyone else's were, and I felt their eyes pass over me with that particular cocktail of mild curiosity and dismissal that wealthy people save for those they've already ranked below themselves. The floor was polished marble, throwing the chandelier light right back at you. My dress shoes, worn, not new, squeaked with every step. Like an announcement nobody had asked for. "Miranda," I said, keeping my voice level even as my chest tightened. "I was thinking we could head out soon. Maybe grab some food on the way, that Thai place over on Peachtree you used to love." The conversation around her died instantly, like someone had cut the power. I watched Miranda's expression shift from bright and animated to something cold and precise, the look of someone who's just decided to make a point. Vince's hand didn't budge from her back. He looked at me with a smile that had absolutely no warmth in it, all teeth, like a wolf that had already sized up the rabbit and was just taking its time. The people around them suddenly found their champagne glasses fascinating, eyes darting back and forth between us like they could feel the impact coming. "Daniel," she said, and the way she said my name made it sound like a diagnosis she was relaying to a specialist. "I'm in the middle of something. Can you just go wait somewhere until I'm ready?" "We've been here 3 hours," I said, trying to sound reasonable even as the heat behind my eyes started building. "You haven't said a word to me since we walked in. I'm just saying maybe we could spend a little time together. That's all." What came next is the part that's burned into me, the kind of memory that replays with the brutal clarity that only real trauma seems to produce. Miranda turned to face me completely. And I watched her mouth pull into a smile that had nothing to do with being happy and everything to do with intent. The kind of smile a cat has right before the pounce. The string quartet in the corner seemed to go silent, or maybe they didn't. I couldn't hear anything anymore except the blood moving through my ears and the slow, steady thud of my own heartbeat. "You want to know what the problem is, Daniel?" she said, her voice pitched just loud enough that everyone nearby could catch every single word. "The problem is that you trail around after me like a dog that's been lost too long, begging for crumbs of my time like you're some kind of charity case I'm obligated to maintain. Do you have any idea what it feels like to have you following me through these rooms? Standing there in your cheap suit with your rough hands, making it look like I settled for less than I was worth?" Someone behind me actually gasped. I heard a muffled "oh my God" from somewhere in the crowd. The string quartet may or may not have kept playing, I honestly couldn't tell anymore. All I could register was the sound of blood in my ears and the beat of my own heart, which was, surprisingly, steady. I noticed Vince had his phone out, angled in a way that suggested documentation, probably thinking about the story he'd tell later. The time his girlfriend's husband imploded at a gallery opening. The words hit me like direct hits, each one landing precisely in the places she knew were unguarded, the insecurities I'd handed her during quiet nights when I actually believed we were building something real together. She knew about the nightmares that still yank me awake at 3 a.m. She knew about the survivor's guilt, the question of why I came home when so many of my brothers didn't. She knew about the imposter syndrome that followed me into every cocktail party and corporate event she dragged me to. She had held all of that. And now she was using it as ammunition, deploying it in front of an audience of strangers who would be dining out on this story for years. Vince was still wearing that predator's grin. Drinking it all in like it was the finest thing being served that evening. "Miranda, please," I started. She wasn't even close to done. "Going forward," she announced, and I mean announced, voice carrying across the gallery like a verdict being read aloud, "I will decide when we spend time together or have any kind of conversation. Do you understand me? Stop chasing me around like you're desperate. Stop calling 15 times a day to ask about my schedule. Stop appearing at my office with lunch like we're starring in some kind of romantic comedy. Know your place, Daniel. Know your place." What followed was a silence so complete it had weight. The kind of silence where you can hear your own blood moving and traffic sounds bleeding in from the street outside. Everyone in our section of the gallery was watching me, waiting. Waiting for the eruption. Waiting for the thing that a man with my background was obviously going to do. Waiting for the scene that would give them something to talk about. Vince actually laughed. Soft, low, but it landed like a slap. And I watched him pull Miranda against him in a proprietary squeeze that was staged entirely for my benefit. Here's what people don't always understand about being a Marine. Yes, they train you to respond to threats with controlled, decisive force. To meet aggression head on. To neutralize whatever's putting your people at risk. But they also build something else into you, a discipline so deep it becomes structural. The kind of self-control that lets you sit completely still while rounds are snapping past your head. That makes you wait for the right moment rather than wasting everything on panic. All of that kicked in as I stood there, absorbing what Miranda had just done. I felt my breathing slow. My heart rate dropped. My body was ready, but not for what they thought was coming. I wasn't going to hand these people their show. Wasn't going to confirm every assumption they had about men like me, working class, rough-handed, emotionally volatile. Wasn't going to give Miranda the weapon she needed to reframe herself as the victim. Instead, something inside me shifted. A deep, structural realignment. The love I'd been white-knuckling onto, the hope that we could somehow get back to whatever we'd been at the start, it didn't break. It just evaporated. Like mist when the sun finally comes out and burns it away completely. I set my champagne glass on the nearest surface. Gently. Carefully. The gentleness seemed to catch people off guard. I squared my shoulders the way my drill instructor had drilled into me at Paris Island. And when I spoke, my voice was exactly what it needed to be: calm, clear, and final. The voice of a man who has already made his decision and is now simply carrying it out. "You're right, Miranda," I said, looking directly at her. "I have been chasing you. Holding on to something that clearly isn't there anymore. But here's the thing about chasing: eventually, a man has to stop and ask himself whether whatever he's running after is actually worth catching." And I just answered that question. I pivoted on my heel with parade ground precision and walked toward the exit. Back straight. Head up. The crowd moved aside. I could already hear the whispers spinning up behind me, the gossip engine firing to life, ready to spread this across every social circle in Atlanta by morning. Miranda called something after me, her voice carrying a note I hadn't heard in it for a long time, something uncertain. I didn't turn around. Didn't give her a single look back. The night air outside hit me like a release. Clean and cool after all that suffocating perfume and performance. My truck was parked 3 blocks away. The valet had looked at my 10-year-old Ford F-150 like it might somehow contaminate the Maseratis lined up out front. I walked those 3 blocks in a state that was somewhere between shock and something that felt, oddly, like freedom. By the time I got into that worn leather seat and shut the door, my mind was already moving. Clicking through next steps with the tactical clarity that had kept me alive through more firefights than I cared to count. The drive back to the Buckhead house took 40 minutes in light traffic. I used every one of those minutes to think. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, a 3-story statement of Miranda's ambitions that we had no business being able to afford, but that she had declared non-negotiable for the image she needed to project. I had worked double shifts at the port for 2 straight years to cover the down payment. Gave up vacations, hobbies, anything resembling personal fulfillment, to make sure Miranda had everything she said she needed. And what had it bought me? A public execution in front of strangers, and a wife who had apparently long since started seeing me as a liability to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I didn't sleep that night. But it wasn't the restless, anxious kind of sleeplessness. I moved through the house with purpose, pulling documents, making lists, preparing for what I knew was coming. The Marine Corps had etched it into me: proper preparation prevents poor performance. I was going to execute this withdrawal the same way I'd executed every mission, with precision and zero wasted motion. By 3 in the morning I had located the marriage certificate, the prenuptial agreement Miranda had insisted on and that I had, fortunately, read with actual care before signing, 5 years of financial records, and documentation covering every major purchase we'd made together. The house was quiet in the way that places get quiet when 2 people have stopped really sharing a life and are just occupying the same square footage. I moved through rooms Miranda had decorated without once asking what I thought, past furniture she'd picked because it photographed well for her social media, under light fixtures that had cost more than my first vehicle. Every single object in that house was a small reminder of how thoroughly my preferences had been treated as irrelevant. How completely I had allowed myself to disappear in the name of keeping the peace. In the kitchen, I brewed a pot of strong coffee and sat at the Italian marble island that Miranda had imported at a cost that still made me flinch to think about. The stone was cold against my palms. I thought about all the times I'd sat in this exact spot, waiting for her to get home, telling myself that tonight might be different. That tonight she might look at me the way she had during our courtship, before she'd decided I was a project that needed upgrading rather than a partner who deserved to be seen. By 5 in the morning, I'd packed 2 duffel bags with everything that actually mattered to me, which turned out to be far less than I expected. Some clothes. My military decorations and discharge papers. My father's toolbox, or at least the toolbox belonging to the man I had always believed was my father. And a handful of photographs from before Miranda had decided that my Marine Corps background was something to conceal from her sophisticated crowd rather than something to stand behind. I held one of those photos for a while. Me in full dress uniform on the day I received the Bronze Star. My face younger. My eyes still holding something bright that had gradually faded across years of trying to be someone I wasn't built to be. I tucked it in carefully. I left behind the expensive watch from our 5th anniversary. The designer clothes she'd insisted I buy. Every artifact of the 7-year performance I'd been putting on. None of it had ever really been mine. It was a wardrobe for a character in Miranda's story. And now that the story was over, I had no use for any of it. The wedding ring came off last. I set it on the glass coffee table with a sound that seemed to carry through the empty house like a gunshot. Next to it, I placed the divorce papers I'd downloaded and completed during the night, already signed everywhere that needed my signature. I didn't write a long letter. Didn't pour out my feelings in some final bid to be understood. Just one sticky note on the bathroom mirror, right where she'd see it when she came home. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. Don't look for me. The sun was just beginning to come up over the Atlanta skyline when I walked out of that house for the last time. And I remember thinking that there's a particular kind of beauty to a sunrise after a night with no sleep, like the universe offering you something for making it all the way through the dark. My truck fired up on the first try despite its age, and I pointed it south toward Savannah, where I'd been running a small workshop for the past few years. A place where I repaired heavy equipment for the Port Authority and got to breathe when Miranda decided she needed relief from what she called my oppressive presence. The drive usually ran about 4 hours, but I stopped twice. Once for coffee. Once to just sit by the road and let the reality of what I was doing move through me in layers, grief, anger, and underneath all of it, something that felt genuinely close to relief. 7 years. 7 years of trying to be enough for a woman who had never really wanted me, who had chosen me because I was solid and reliable and conveniently available at the moment she decided she needed a husband to round out her career image. Who had methodically chipped away at everything that made me who I was until I barely recognized the person I saw in mirrors anymore. When I finally pulled up to my Savannah workshop on the edge of the city's industrial port district, the building looked better than it had any right to. A converted warehouse I'd picked up for almost nothing 5 years earlier and slowly turned into something that worked. The smell hit me the moment I opened the door, grease and metal and a faint salt tang from the ocean nearby. The honest smells of actual work and actual purpose. This was where I still felt like myself. The back corner held a small living space I'd set up for late nights, a cot, a hot plate, a bathroom with a shower that produced lukewarm water on a good day. It wasn't much. But it was completely and entirely mine, in a way the Buckhead house had never come close to being. When I set my duffel bags down on the concrete floor, I felt something release in my chest for the first time in years. The weeks that followed blurred together in a combination of physical work and emotional recovery that I couldn't have untangled even if I'd tried. I threw myself into the job with everything I had, taking on repairs that other mechanics had written off as hopeless, pushing my body to the edge of exhaustion every single day so I'd be too spent at night to lie awake replaying Miranda and Vince in every way I'd failed to become the man she wanted. Word got around. The Port Authority started routing more work my way. Daniel Wright could fix anything. He didn't walk away from a job. His pricing was fair and his work was solid. There was something deeply satisfying about restoring broken things, taking equipment the world had written off and making it run again. Every engine I brought back, every hydraulic system I put right, every machine I returned to service felt like a small, quiet victory against decay. I understood machines in a way I'd never quite managed to understand people. Could diagnose problems by sound alone. Could feel when something was failing before it actually failed. If only people came with fault codes and repair manuals. Maybe I would have seen what was happening with Miranda long before I did. The other mechanics started calling me the miracle worker, half a joke, but with real respect underneath it. Old Jack Patterson, who'd spent 40 years working ships and cranes, told me one afternoon that he hadn't come across talent like mine since his own mentor had retired back in the 80s. A young guy named Marcus, who reminded me of an earlier version of myself, started hanging around my bay after hours asking questions they didn't cover in any trade school curriculum. Without really planning to, I became a teacher, passing along knowledge that had taken me years of trial and error and dirty hands to accumulate. In whatever free time I had, I studied engineering manuals, technical documents on hydraulics and automated systems. I filled the hours I'd once spent trying to meet Miranda's standards with knowledge that would actually hold up. The local community college offered night classes in mechanical engineering, and I enrolled in as many as my schedule allowed, sitting in rooms full of students half my age, absorbing everything. My professors figured out quickly that I wasn't there to check a box. I wanted to understand the principles underneath the procedures. Some of them started staying late to go deeper with me, covering material that never made it into the standard syllabus. My hands were permanently stained with grease. My back ached every morning from the demands of the work. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was actually constructing something, not maintaining an illusion. The cot in the back of the workshop became my home. A spare, stripped-down existence that would have horrified Miranda, and that suited me perfectly. Simple meals. Clean, organized space. And slowly, day by day, I started remembering who I'd been before I'd tried to reshape myself into someone else's idea of acceptable. Miranda called 3 times that first week. I let every call roll to voicemail without listening to the messages. Her texts swung from fury to remorse to legal threats, a whiplash of emotional pressure that would have worked on me a month earlier and now just seemed exhausting. She showed up at the workshop once, hammering on the door, demanding to be let in. I'd already changed the locks and had a security system installed with help from some military contacts. Eventually she got back in her leased Mercedes and drove away. The divorce papers came back signed 10 days after I'd left them on the coffee table. When I saw her signature next to mine, all I felt was relief. The thing about hitting bottom is that once you're there, the only available direction is up. And I started climbing with a focus that surprised even me. I invested my modest savings into upgrading the workshop, better equipment, better tools. I hired a helper, a kid named Tommy from a rough part of Savannah who'd grown up in his father's garage and had that same hungry look in his eyes I remembered from my own reflection at that age. Together we started landing bigger contracts. More complicated work. The kind that required creativity and problem solving, not just brute force mechanical skill. 3 months after I left Miranda, I was driving back from a parts run near Charleston when the hurricane arrived with almost no warning. The forecast had it curving northeast, missing the coast entirely. But hurricanes make their own decisions about where they want to go. And this one had apparently decided it wanted to introduce itself personally to anyone foolish enough to still be on the road. The rain came down so hard my wipers couldn't keep pace even maxed out. The wind was pushing my truck around on the highway like it weighed nothing. I should have pulled over. Should have found an overpass or a parking structure and waited it out. But stubbornness had been thoroughly installed by the Marine Corps, and it doesn't uninstall easily. The road was almost empty, the sensible people having taken the warning seriously in a way I apparently hadn't. My headlights could barely cut through the wall of water in front of me. My hands were white-knuckled on the wheel. The radio had gone silent about 10 miles back, cutting off right in the middle of a weather update that was almost certainly advising people to stay home. Lightning split the sky in patterns that seemed to hang in the air for seconds before the thunder followed, so loud it went straight through your ribs. The sedan came out of nowhere. A silver flash spinning across the flooded highway like something frictionless, like a puck crossing ice. I watched it happen in that stretched out slow motion that trauma always seems to produce. The car losing the argument with physics. Sliding through the guardrail at the edge of a steep drop-off as if the barrier were made of cardboard rather than reinforced steel. It went over the edge, tumbling, at least twice that I could track, before the darkness swallowed it. Even over the noise of the storm, I caught the sound, crumpling metal, shattering glass, and then the heavy silence of something that had come to rest somewhere it was never meant to be. I pulled over without even consciously deciding to. My body was already moving, every piece of training I'd ever received firing at once, the same surge of locked-in calm that had carried me through ambushes and firefights and every other situation where falling apart would have gotten people killed. The rain soaked me through in seconds. The wind nearly knocked me sideways as I made my way to the broken guardrail. None of it registered. There was a person, or people, in that vehicle, and there was a window of time, and everything else was just noise. The embankment was steep and slick with mud. I half climbed and half slid my way down to where the car had come to rest against a cluster of pine trees. The front end had crumpled like an accordion. The headlights were somehow still on, throwing strange beams through the rain and mist. The smell of gasoline was sharp enough to sting the eyes. There was a woman inside. Visible through the shattered driver's side window, unconscious, slumped into her seatbelt, blood running from a cut across her forehead. She looked to be in her 60s. Silver hair now matted dark with blood. Expensive jewelry catching what little light there was. The door was jammed solid. The impact had folded the frame. I had to use everything I had to wrench it open, feeling the metal fight me and then finally surrender with a shriek that cut through the storm. Getting her out was like solving a puzzle designed to stay unsolved, working around deployed airbags and bent metal, trying to move her without torquing her spine in case she'd taken damage to her back. The rain made everything slippery. I nearly lost my grip on her twice. But eventually I had her free, and I was carrying her up the embankment with every muscle screaming and my lungs burning. By the time the ambulance arrived, I'd been doing CPR for what felt like a long time, probably closer to 15 minutes. The paramedics had to physically pull me back before I'd stop. One of them said something about her pulse being faint but there, about how close she'd been to not making it, about how my being there had likely made the difference. I barely processed any of it. I just sat down in the rain at the edge of the road and watched them load her in and drive away, lights and sirens going. At the hospital, I sat in the waiting room in soaking wet clothes, leaving small puddles on the floor, collecting disapproving looks from the night staff that I was too drained to care about. Hours went by. At some point someone brought me a blanket and a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during a previous decade, but it was warm and it had caffeine and that made it acceptable. I couldn't have explained why I stayed. Marines don't leave casualties behind, maybe it was that. Maybe it was just basic decency. Or maybe it was something I wouldn't understand until later. The doctor who finally came to speak with me looked like a man who'd been awake far too long. Bloodshot eyes, stethoscope around his neck like it had grown there. He asked if I was family. I explained what had happened out on the road, and watched his expression shift from professional neutral to something that looked like actual respect. "She's stable," he said. "But she lost a significant amount of blood, and she has a rare blood type. We're running low and the storm has complicated getting more." "What type?" I asked. I didn't know why it mattered. Something in me just needed to know. "AB negative," he said. "Under 1% of the population." Something clicked in the back of my mind. Military medical processing. Blood typing, standard procedure. "That's my type," I said. "AB negative. I can donate." He looked at me the way you look at something that shouldn't exist but clearly does. Minutes later I was in a room with a nurse who had kind eyes and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. She made small talk while the bag filled, asking about the accident, the rescue, how I'd ended up being both the Good Samaritan and the compatible donor in the same night. "It's almost like fate," she said, smiling in a way that told you she genuinely believed that was possible. I was about to give her my standard response, the one that takes shape in a man who's watched too much random death to believe in anything so tidy. But then a different doctor came in, younger, with an urgent expression. "The patient is stable," he said, "but our lab flagged something unusual in the compatibility analysis. We need to run additional tests on both samples." I didn't think much of it. Some technical medical thing that would resolve itself. But when the results came back the following morning, they didn't resolve anything. They detonated everything I thought I knew about my own life. The woman I had pulled from that ravine was named Sarah Wright. And according to the DNA testing the hospital had run as part of their standard verification process, she was my biological mother. Let me explain just how impossible that felt in the moment, how thoroughly it contradicted the entire architecture of my understanding of who I was. I had been raised by James and Mary Wright in small-town rural Georgia. Had grown up believing without question that I was their son. Had no reason, ever, to doubt it. My father had died when I was 16, heart attack out in the fields, and my mother had followed him 4 years later, hollowed out by grief and the relentless burden of trying to hold the farm together alone. The idea that I hadn't been their biological child. That I had been taken as an infant and raised by someone else entirely. That my real mother was a wealthy woman who had been searching for me for 3 decades, it felt less like reality and more like a premise someone had pitched to a television network. But DNA doesn't negotiate. And as Sarah recovered over the following days, the actual story of where I came from began to surface. I had been taken from a shopping cart outside an Atlanta supermarket at 8 months old. Snatched by a woman named Mary Wright, whose own infant had died of SIDS just weeks before, and whose grief had cracked something fundamental in her perception of what was real and what she was allowed to do. The police investigation had stalled. The woman who took me had vanished into the rural quiet of Georgia farm country, and Sarah Wright had spent the 30 years since refusing to stop looking. We sat together in her hospital room on the 3rd day, both of us still trying to make the math work on what had happened. She was sitting up now, head bandaged, eyes clear and sharp with an intelligence that the trauma and medication hadn't managed to dim. "I'm not going to pretend this isn't strange," I said, because I had never been good at softening things and couldn't think of a reason to start. "I didn't pull you out of that car because I was looking for a mother. I didn't know you existed. I did it because leaving you there wasn't something I was capable of doing." Sarah looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that's actually an assessment. Measuring you. Taking stock. Deciding whether you're worth the investment of her trust. "I know," she said. "If you'd known exactly who I was, you would have done the same thing. I can see that in you. You have your father's eyes, did you know that? Richard passed 12 years ago. But I still catch him in the mirror sometimes, and now I'm catching him in yours." She told me about her life, the logistics company she'd rebuilt after Richard's death, turning a modest trucking operation into a multi-state enterprise that moved cargo from one end of the country to the other. She told me about the investigators she'd hired over the years, the dead ends, the false leads, the slow and painful process of learning to hold hope loosely without letting it go entirely. And she told me about the grandchildren she'd imagined giving Richard, the legacy she'd wanted to extend, the particular kind of emptiness that success never quite managed to fill. "I can't return your childhood to you," she said, and even after 30 years, the grief in her voice was real and close. "I can't undo what happened, not to you, not to me, not to your father. But there's something else I can give you, if you'll take it. The resources to build whatever future you actually want." It would have been easy to be suspicious. To wonder if she was trying to purchase my goodwill, or position me for something I couldn't yet see. But I'd spent enough time with her by then to recognize the kind of core strength she carried, the same uncompromising backbone I'd developed through my own years of hard service. She wasn't offering me rescue. She was offering me a partnership. A chance to demonstrate what I was worth, and that demonstration would have nothing to do with whose blood I carried. I'm not interested in being handed things, I told her. I've been self-sufficient since I was 20, and I'm not looking to change that. Sarah smiled, and it was the first time I'd seen genuine approval in her expression. I'd be concerned if you were. What I'm offering isn't charity, Daniel. It's an investment. I've spent 4 decades building something real, and I need someone who can help me push it further. Someone who knows what hard work actually is. Someone who's not afraid to be in the thick of it. Everything I've heard about you in these last few days tells me that's exactly who you are. The terms we agreed on were clear. Sarah would put up the capital to transform my workshop into a serious industrial operation. In return, I'd work alongside her company to develop new technology for the logistics sector. She'd hold 49% of the new venture. I'd control 51%, and no major decision would move without both of us signing off. Equal partnership. Not a parent bailing out a son. And that distinction mattered more to me than I had language for. We spent hours in that hospital room hammering out the specifics, and I came away genuinely impressed by her, by how precisely she understood her industry, which innovations actually created value versus which ones were just technology in search of a problem to justify itself. When I walked her through the ideas I'd been developing in my head during all those night classes at the community college, she didn't wave them off as too ambitious. She asked hard questions that forced me to confront the implementation problems I'd been conveniently skating around. Over the months that followed, I turned that small Savannah workshop into something that made my previous operation look like a hobby space. With Sarah's capital behind it, I brought in serious equipment, hired skilled technicians, and started chasing the engineering innovations I'd been dreaming about for years. We called it Right Systems, a name that honored both where we came from and what we were building together. The transformation was intense in the best possible way. We broke ground on a new facility in March, a purpose-built manufacturing complex that would eventually employ over 200 people and ship product to ports around the world. I personally oversaw every phase of construction, from the foundation pour to the final electrical hookups. The contractors learned fast that I wasn't the kind of owner who signed checks and disappeared. I'd show up unannounced at any hour. My standards weren't a guideline. They were the floor. The work demanded everything from me, physical and mental, hands and mind, and I found that deeply satisfying in a way that was hard to explain to people who hadn't experienced the alternative. I developed hydraulic systems that outperformed anything currently on the market. I built robotic maintenance equipment that could handle operations that had previously required whole crews. I filed patents for innovations that major logistics companies were already getting in line to license. Tommy, my first hire from the early Savannah days, turned out to be irreplaceable. In less than a year he'd gone from shop assistant to floor manager to head of the entire manufacturing division. I recruited engineers from universities across the Southeast, offering them real problems to solve instead of incremental improvements to things that already worked well enough. The company grew faster than any reasonable projection would have predicted, and within 12 months we had contracts with 3 of the biggest shipping companies on the eastern seaboard. Sarah watched it all develop with a satisfaction that ran deeper than business results. I understood, by then, that Right Systems meant something to her beyond revenue and market position. It was evidence. Proof that the decades between us hadn't cost her son the potential she'd always believed he had. Meanwhile, the life Miranda had chosen was quietly coming apart. The first signs surfaced about 6 months after the divorce was finalized, whispers through professional networks about irregularities at her firm. I dismissed them at first. Successful people attract jealousy. But the whispers got louder and more specific, and eventually I couldn't keep not hearing them. Vince Caldwell, it turned out, was not the financial mastermind he'd spent years presenting himself as at gallery openings and charity galas. He was a professional predator. A con artist who had built his entire career around identifying insecure, ambitious people and systematically separating them from their money. The revolutionary opportunity he'd been pitching was a pyramid scheme, an elegant house of cards that would function perfectly until the moment it didn't, and then collapse completely. Miranda, blinded by her attraction to Vince and her hunger to climb higher, had made the catastrophic error of putting not just her own savings into his venture, but client funds. She'd falsified documents, forged signatures, committed fraud at a scale that was almost impressive in its scope. When the structure finally gave way, as it was always going to, she was standing at the center of the wreckage. The firm fired her immediately. Licensing boards pulled her credentials with a speed that left skid marks. Banks foreclosed on the Buckhead house, took back the Mercedes, and froze every account she had access to. The crowd that had surrounded her at that gallery opening, all those laughing, well-dressed people who had watched her humiliate me without saying a word, became suddenly, universally unavailable. Full calendars. Unanswered calls. The whole performance. I'd be lying if I told you I felt nothing when I learned all of this. I didn't achieve some clean spiritual detachment from the suffering of a woman who had put me through what she'd put me through. What I felt was more complicated than that, a tangle of vindication and sadness and something that might have grown into actual compassion if I'd let it. She had treated me badly. That was real. But she was also still a human being in serious pain, and I wasn't entirely sure what kind of man I wanted to be when faced with that. The question got sharper about 10 months after the divorce, when Miranda walked into the Right Systems lobby on a Tuesday afternoon. She looked nothing like the person who had commanded rooms at corporate events and gallery openings. Her clothes were creased. Her makeup was uneven. The dark circles under her eyes told you she hadn't had a real night's sleep in weeks. The front desk tried to turn her away. Miranda made enough noise that security eventually called me to come handle it. We sat in my office, a space built for function, not display, all engineering diagrams and prototype components rather than curated art and framed accomplishments. She looked around at what I'd built with an expression that seemed to be fighting a war between resentment and calculation. I waited for her to go first, because patience in negotiations was another thing the Corps had given me. Danny, she started, the nickname she always reached for when she needed something from me. I know things ended badly. But we were married for 7 years. That has to count for something. I'm in real trouble. Serious trouble. And there's no one else I can go to. Vince is gone, took everything and disappeared. Now they're saying I'm the one who designed the whole thing. Danny, I could actually go to prison. She leaned forward, and I could see her sliding into the version of herself that had worked on me effectively for years, the mode she switched on when she wanted something she knew was a long shot. I'm not asking for money, she said, in the tone of someone who is absolutely asking for money. I just need help navigating this. Someone with the right connections, who can point me toward the right lawyers, the right people. You've always been the one who could fix things, Danny. Fix this for me, and I'll do whatever you want. We could start fresh. Be the real partners we never quite managed to be. I was foolish to let Vince get between us. I listened to every word the way you'd watch a film you've already seen, observing the craft of the performance without being moved by it. When she finished, she leaned back with the confidence of someone who had never truly been refused anything she'd committed to pursuing. Do you remember what you said to me at the Hartwell Gallery? I asked, keeping my voice even. Something crossed her face that might have been shame, if it had been allowed to stay. It didn't. I was drinking, she said. I was performing for my colleagues. I didn't mean any of it. You meant every single word, I said. You'd been meaning it for years. That night you just finally stopped editing yourself. And honestly, Miranda, I'm grateful for it. Hearing you say it out loud was the best thing that ever happened to me. It showed me with complete clarity what I was actually dealing with. What our marriage had actually become. And it gave me everything I needed to walk away. I got up and stood at the window, looking out over the industrial complex that had grown from a small converted warehouse into something I was genuinely proud of. I'm not going to help you, I said. Not out of anger. Not for revenge. I'm not going to help you because you never actually wanted a partner. You wanted someone to serve you. And I'm done playing that role. Miranda's composure cracked. What was underneath it was raw and desperate. You owe me, she said, her voice climbing. I stood by you through all those years when you were just a mechanic working the docks. I dealt with your nightmares and your moods and your complete inability to exist in normal society. You owe me. I don't owe you a thing, I said, and the words came easily, without effort. I worked double shifts for 2 years to put a down payment on a house you wanted. I sacrificed everything I cared about to try to make you happy. I gave you everything I had, and you used it against me in front of 50 strangers. If I ever owed you anything, that debt was settled in full that night. I reached for the intercom. Security, I need you to escort my visitor out. She's overstayed her welcome. The guards handled it professionally, firm and calm, steering Miranda toward the exit while she announced things about lawyers and injustice and consequences I would regret. I watched her go without feeling much of anything. Just a quiet, settled certainty that I had done the right thing. The legal proceedings got significant local media coverage, though I made a deliberate choice not to follow it closely. Vince had been picked up trying to cross into Canada with a bag full of cash and a collection of fraudulent passports. He'd moved quickly to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a better deal, his cooperation consisting mostly of redirecting blame at everyone within reach. Miranda ended up facing a charge list that was extensive and damning. I showed up to the sentencing hearing without being entirely sure why. Closure, maybe. Curiosity. Or just the human need to witness the end of a story that had consumed so much of your life. The courtroom was sparsely filled, a handful of journalists, a few of Vince's other victims who'd come looking for whatever resolution a sentencing can actually provide. Miranda's former colleagues were nowhere to be found. Their association with her had apparently been quietly reclassified from asset to liability. Miranda looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. The orange jumpsuit and the handcuffs had stripped away the architecture of her identity, the clothes, the makeup, the carefully maintained projection of competence and arrival. What remained was a woman in her mid-30s who had made a sequence of choices that had demolished her life, sitting in a courtroom waiting to learn the full damage. Her attorney made the usual arguments: remorse, circumstances, the outsized influence of Vince Caldwell. Cast her as a victim who had been manipulated into complicity. But the evidence didn't leave much room for that reading. Emails she'd written. Documents she'd signed. Phone recordings where she discussed, in specific terms, how to keep regulators from looking too closely. Whatever pressure Vince had applied, Miranda had been a knowing and active participant in stealing millions from people who had trusted her. The judge was a woman who had no patience for white-collar predators. 12 years in federal prison. Parole possible after 8, contingent on exceptional conduct. When the number landed, Miranda went pale. She looked around the courtroom the way people do when they're hoping someone will step forward and declare a mistake has been made. Her eyes found mine. We looked at each other across the courtroom for a moment. I thought about the woman I had actually married, the one with bright eyes and a genuine enthusiasm for my military background, who had made me feel like I was enough exactly as I was. I wondered what had happened to her. Whether she had ever really existed in the way I'd believed, or whether I'd wanted so badly to be loved that I'd constructed qualities that weren't there. She didn't find whatever she was looking for in my expression. I wasn't offering satisfaction at her downfall. Wasn't offering pity either. What I was feeling, mostly, was exhausted. Exhausted by the history, the emotion, the weight of everything our shared years had cost both of us. A television on the courtroom wall was running the local news, sound off. I glanced at it while the bailiffs moved to take Miranda out, and did a double take at what was on the screen. There I was, standing next to Sarah at the grand opening of a veterans support center that Right Systems had funded in downtown Savannah. The Chiron identified us as local business leaders give back to community. Sarah was smiling as she cut the ribbon. I was standing beside her in a suit that actually fit, looking more at ease in my own skin than I had at any point during my marriage. I hadn't thought of that day as anything particularly significant when we'd planned it, just the most logical thing I could do with the gratitude I felt toward the Corps and the desire to do something useful for veterans who were struggling to land on the other side of service. But watching it on that screen, set against the backdrop of what Miranda's choices had produced, something became very clear to me about the roads people take and where those roads eventually go. The center would offer housing, job training, and mental health resources to veterans in the Savannah area, services I knew from direct personal experience were desperately needed and chronically underfunded. We'd staffed it with counselors who specialized in PTSD, employment professionals who actually understood how military experience translated to civilian work, and housing advocates who knew the veterans' benefits system from the inside out. Sarah had been firm that we fund it properly, not as a public relations exercise, but as a genuine commitment to doing something that mattered. The building was nothing fancy. Solid, functional, designed to serve its purpose well. Sound engineering principles, applied to a human problem. I thought about the men I had served alongside who had come home and found that what they'd learned in combat didn't map cleanly onto any job listing. The ones who'd ended up on the street, or incarcerated, or gone by their own hands because no one had been positioned to help them make the crossing from one life to another. This center wouldn't reach all of them. But it would reach some. And some was enough to make it worth everything we'd put into it, many times over. When the hearing wrapped up and Miranda was taken away to begin her sentence, I left the courthouse and drove to the waterfront. Parked near the docks where I had once been a mechanic with a failing marriage and no clear way forward, and walked out onto a pier that stretched into the Atlantic. The water was calm. The late afternoon light was breaking across the surface in shifting gold and blue. I stood there for a long time, watching it move. Sarah found me about an hour later. Of course she did, she'd spent 30 years looking for me, and she wasn't about to misplace me now that she'd found me. The sentencing was today, she said, stepping up beside me. It was. Are you okay? I took the question seriously before I answered it, because Sarah had earned honesty and I had learned through hard experience that glossing over your actual emotional state only creates larger problems further down the road. I don't feel good about what happened to her, I said. I don't feel bad about it either. I think mostly I just feel finished. The chapter is closed. The story ended. And I'm ready for whatever comes next. Sarah nodded, she understood that on a level that went past words. She'd spent decades of her own life waiting for closure on something that had felt unresolvable. She knew that some wounds don't fully heal, but can eventually stop bleeding if you give them enough time and enough care. There's something I've been wanting to give you, she said, reaching into her coat and producing a small velvet box. Your father, your biological father, Richard, had this made when I was pregnant. He was completely certain you were going to be a boy, and he wanted you to have something that would connect you to the family history. Inside the box was a pocket watch. Antique. Clearly valuable. The Wright family crest engraved into the case. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it, all that history and expectation, and something that felt like the first real sign of a future that was, finally, 38 years late, starting to open up. He would have been proud of you, Sarah said. I know that probably doesn't land the way it might coming from someone who knew him. But I spent 25 years with that man, and I know exactly the kind of son he was hoping for. You're it, Daniel. You're exactly that. I put the watch in my pocket. Felt it settle against my hip like something anchoring me to something larger than myself. The sun was getting low now, painting the sky in colors that seemed too vivid to be real. I watched the light fade and the first stars appear in the darkening sky above the water. I spent so long trying to be what Miranda needed me to be, I said, the words coming slowly, because I was working through something I hadn't quite fully said out loud yet. The wardrobe she wanted. The way she wanted me to talk, to move, to take up space. Trying to transform into someone I was never made to be. The whole time thinking that if I just worked hard enough at it, if I just changed enough, she'd eventually see me. Really see me. Sarah listened without interrupting. That particular skill, just being present and not filling silence with noise, was one of the things I'd come to value most in her. But that was never going to happen, I said. Because Miranda wasn't actually looking at me. She was looking at a mirror. She was projecting her own ambitions and her own fears onto someone who was standing right there in front of her, wanting to be seen. I could have turned myself completely inside out and she still would have missed me, because she had no interest in who I actually was. She was attached to the version of me she'd scripted in her own head. I turned to face Sarah directly. Saw the understanding in her eyes. But you see me, I said. From that very first day in the hospital, before you had any idea who I was, you looked at me like I was someone worth actually knowing. Not a project. Not a problem. A person who had his own worth and his own place in the world. That's what mothers do, Sarah said quietly. Even when they've missed the first 37 years. We stood there a while longer as the stars multiplied and the moon came up over the ocean that had seen so much of Savannah's long history. Somewhere behind us in that city, Wright Systems was humming along, building technology that was starting to reshape the logistics industry and supporting hundreds of workers who counted on us. Somewhere in a federal facility, Miranda was beginning to reckon with the consequences of decisions made in pursuit of a success that had never been real. And somewhere in the space inside my chest where I had carried the weight of rejection and inadequacy for so long, something lighter had taken up residence. Something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like peace. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the cheap lighter Miranda had given me years ago. The only gift she had ever chosen herself, not through an assistant, not from a list someone had curated for her. A gas station impulse buy that she'd wrapped in newspaper and handed me on our first Christmas together, back when we were too broke for anything more and it hadn't mattered. I'd carried it ever since. Not because it had any monetary value, but because it had once meant something. Because it reminded me of a time when the possibility of us had still seemed real. I flipped it open. Watched the flame hold against the evening breeze. Then closed it, drew my arm back, and sent it out over the water in a clean arc. It landed somewhere out in the dark with a sound too small to hear from where I was standing. I didn't watch for where it hit. That part didn't matter. What mattered was the letting go.